What would you sacrifice for someone you were supposed to hate? Commander Marcus Chen stared at the holographic footage replaying for the 100th time. Watching General Sarah Voss, humanity's greatest military strategist and his mentor, dissolve into atoms as the Caltharian Empire's plasma strike obliterated her flagship during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. The Empire claimed it was a defensive action, that the general had made a threatening move. But Marcus saw the truth in the cold precision of that strike. It was an execution, calculated and deliberate, meant to send a message that humanity was beneath the Empire's consideration. Within 6 hours, every human colony, station, and outpost received the same transmission from Earth's unified command: total mobilization. No quarter. This was humanity's last stand against an empire that had pushed them to extinction's edge. Marcus felt the weight of his new rank, the stars on his collar still unfamiliar, as he took command of the stealth frigate Revenant, tasked with deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines, knowing that every second brought them closer to a war that would either forge humanity's legend or write its epitaph. 3 weeks into enemy territory, his ship's AI detected an unusual distress beacon emanating from a dying Caltharian diplomatic vessel, drifting in the debris field of what looked like another ship entirely. This one human. Protocol, demanded he. Ignore it or destroy it. But something in the beacon's rhythm seemed wrong. Desperate in a way that transcended species, and against his better judgment, Marcus ordered the rescue operation that would change everything he thought he knew about the enemy and himself. She materialized in his ship's medbay like a ghost wrapped in shimmering silver, her tactical suit torn and bloodied, platinum hair matted against a face so eerily human it made his breath catch, except for those elegant pointed ears that marked her as Caltharian. Her eyes, an impossible shade of violet that seemed to hold entire nebulas, flickered open and locked onto his with such startling intelligence and fear that Marcus instinctively stepped back, hand on his sidearm. Please, her voice was barely a whisper, accented, but perfectly comprehensible. They killed them all, the peace delegation, my father, everyone who wanted to stop this madness. Her name was Lyra Velshara, and she claimed to be the daughter of High Diplomat Kavrin, one of the few Caltharian officials who had opposed General Voss's assassination, who had argued that humanity deserved respect as equals, not extermination as primitives. The official story within the Empire, she explained through tears that seemed far too genuine to be manufactured, was that her father had died in an accident, but she knew the truth: the military faction had purged anyone who stood against total war, and she had barely escaped with evidence that could prove the general's death was orchestrated by War Master Thechner, a zealot who wanted humanity's resources and saw their extermination as inevitable and righteous. Marcus wanted to believe she was a plant, a spy, some elaborate deception. But the raw pain in her eyes and the data crystal she carried told a different story, one that complicated the clean narrative of good versus evil he'd been holding onto like a lifeline. Why should I trust you? He demanded, and Lyra sat up despite her injuries, meeting his gaze with a fierceness that made her seem to glow from within. Because I lost everything to the same monsters you're fighting. And because if we don't stop Thechner together, both our peoples will drown in blood that doesn't need to be spilled. There was something magnetic about her conviction. The way she spoke of peace, not as weakness, but as the hardest choice, the bravest one. And Marcus found himself assigning her quarters instead of the brig. A decision that made his crew exchange worried glances but trust his judgment nonetheless. Over the following weeks, as Revenant continued its reconnaissance mission and Marcus verified Lyra's intelligence through covert sources, he discovered that the Caltharian Empire wasn't the monolithic enemy he'd imagined. It was fractured, with entire fleets quietly opposing Thechner's war doctrine, waiting for a reason to break away, for proof that humanity could be reasoned with rather than destroyed. Lyra became an unexpected presence on his ship, her insights into Caltharian tactics, saving them from 3 separate ambushes. Her quiet competence earning grudging respect from the crew, who had every reason to hate her. Marcus found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way she mourned privately in the observation deck, staring at the stars with a loneliness that mirrored his own, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, as if expecting an assassin's blade, the delicate strength in how she carried herself despite being surrounded by those who saw her as the enemy. She had this habit of humming when she worked on decrypting Caltharian communications, a haunting melody that she explained was a lullaby her mother sang before the Empire's rigid military culture had torn their family apart. And something about that vulnerability made Marcus's chest ache in ways he hadn't felt since losing the general. One night, he found her in the mess hall, staring at a ration pack with obvious confusion, and couldn't help but laugh at her bewildered expression. "You've never seen human food before?" he asked, and she smiled, transforming her whole face into something radiant and warm. "Our briefings covered your weapons, your tactics, your fleet compositions. But somehow the diplomatic corps never mentioned what you eat," she said, with a self-deprecating humor that caught him completely off guard. That moment, simple and absurd, became the first of many where they stopped being soldier and enemy and became simply Marcus and Lyra, two people carrying impossible burdens and finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. She taught him phrases in Caltharian, laughing at his terrible pronunciation, and he showed her human music, watching her eyes widen at the emotional depth of a simple piano composition. "We outlawed music like this generations ago," Lyra admitted quietly. "The Empire said it made people weak, emotional, unable to make the hard choices. But listening to this, I think they were afraid of what it makes us feel connected, empathetic, human in all the ways that matter beyond biology." It was during these conversations that Marcus began to see the war differently. Not as humanity against monsters, but as people on both sides trapped in a conflict engineered by those who benefited from hatred and fear. The evidence Lyra carried implicated not just War Master Thechner but also elements within humanity's own command structure, officials who had known about the threat to General Voss but allowed it to happen, seeing her death as the catalyst needed to unite humanity behind total mobilization, to seize emergency powers and resources that peacetime would never allow. The conspiracy went deeper than either of them had imagined. And suddenly they weren't just trying to stop a war, but expose a rot that infected both sides. A cabal that saw billions of lives as acceptable losses for power and control. Marcus knew he should report directly to Unified Command, but Lyra's warnings about compromised communications and assassins within his own chain of command made him hesitate, made him realize that trust had become the rarest commodity in a galaxy gone mad. The turning point came when Revenant intercepted communications about a joint strike. Thechner's fleet and the human conspirators were planning a false flag operation that would obliterate a neutral colony and blame the opposing side, ensuring that any hope for peace died in nuclear fire and righteous fury. They had 72 hours to stop it, but doing so would require trusting each other absolutely, coordinating with the Caltharian reformist fleet that Lyra claimed was waiting for a signal, and risking everything on the chance that people were better than the worst among them, suggested. "If we do this," Marcus said, his command deck empty except for the two of them, stars streaming past the view screen like tears, "there's no going back. We'll be traitors to some, heroes to others, and probably dead within the week." Lyra stepped closer, and he could see the luminescent quality of her skin in the dim light. The way her violet eyes seemed to look straight through his defenses to the scared man beneath the commander's uniform. "My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when the galaxy is watching, but what they do when doing nothing would be easier and safer," she said softly, her hand finding his with a tentative warmth that sent electricity up his arm. "I don't want easy or safe anymore, Marcus. I want to be able to look at myself and know I tried to be worthy of the people I've lost." Her words struck something deep in his chest. The same thing General Voss had tried to teach him about leadership being service, not glory. And he made his decision with a clarity that felt like destiny clicking into place. He authorized a narrow beam transmission using codes Lyra provided, broadcast to elements of the Caltharian fleet she insisted could be turned, laying out the evidence and proposing a joint operation to stop the false flag attack. The response came faster than expected, not from the Caltharians, but from within his own fleet. Admiral Chen, his uncle and one of Unified Command's inner circle, appeared on the view screen with an expression of profound disappointment and cold fury. "You were supposed to be better than this, Marcus," the Admiral said, and hearing his family name used as a weapon hurt worse than any plasma burn. "That creature has poisoned your mind, turned you against your own species at our darkest hour. The general would be ashamed of what you've become." But before Marcus could respond, Lyra stepped into the view screen's field of view, data crystal held high, her voice ringing with an authority that came from absolute moral certainty. General Sarah Voss died because people like you needed a martyr more than humanity needed its best strategic mind, she declared, and Marcus saw his uncle's face shift from anger to calculation. This crystal contains communications proving you knew about War Master Thechner's plan and actively prevented security measures that would have saved her. You wanted this war, wanted the emergency powers and the united front that only extinction-level threat could provide. And you used both our people's grief and fear to get it. The Admiral's hand moved towards something off-screen, probably a firing solution that would vaporize Revenant before they could transmit the evidence. But the view screen suddenly split as new contacts appeared, 20 Caltharian ships dropping out of TTL in perfect formation. But instead of firing, they positioned themselves between Revenant and the Admiral's advancing fleet. A new face appeared, a Caltharian female with silver stars marking her uniform and the same violet eyes as Lyra. I am Fleet Commander Sira Velshara, and the niece you thought you had murdered sends her regards. Admiral, the woman said, with ice in her voice. Stand down, or learn that there are worse things than the war you've been orchestrating. The standoff lasted 17 seconds that felt like hours. Marcus's heart hammering as he watched weapons systems power up on both sides. Civilization's future balanced on whether one man's pride was worth mutual annihilation. Admiral Chen's face went through a journey of emotions: rage, calculation, fear, and finally bitter resignation as he realized the conspiracy was unraveling. You've won nothing, he spat. Without the unity that war provides, humanity will splinter. We'll turn on each other like we always do. I was trying to save us from ourselves. The transmission cut, and his fleet jumped away, leaving Revenant surrounded by former enemies who were now something far more complicated. Lyra sagged against Marcus, the adrenaline draining from her body, and he caught her instinctively, feeling how fragile she was, despite her strength. How much courage it had taken to stand before the man who had ordered her death and throw the truth in his face. You said your name was Lyra Velshara, Marcus whispered. The fleet commander called herself Sira Velshara. How many of your family survived? Lyra's laugh was broken, painful. Just my aunt and me, and until today I thought I was alone because I was too afraid to reach out. Too certain that the purge had been absolute. You gave me the courage to take that risk. To believe that connection was worth the vulnerability. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that transcended politics and war. And Marcus realized that somewhere between rescuing her and trusting her with his life, his feelings had evolved into something profound and terrifying. The Caltharian reformist fleet, combined with evidence from Lyra's crystal, provided the leverage needed to expose the conspiracy on both sides. War Master Thechner's faction attempted a coup when the evidence went public, but found their support evaporating as Caltharian citizens, tired of endless expansion and military doctrine that sacrificed culture for conquest, rose up in protest. On the human side, Admiral Chen and his co-conspirators were arrested, their claims of pragmatic necessity ringing hollow against the reality of their manipulation and murder. The false flag operation was stopped with less than an hour to spare. The neutral colony evacuated and the conspirators' automated weapons platforms destroyed in a joint operation that saw human and Caltharian Marines fighting side by side for the first time in history. But stopping one attack didn't end the war. Momentum and hatred don't dissolve overnight. And there were still fleets engaged across a dozen systems. Soldiers who had lost friends and family and wanted blood for blood. Marcus found himself at the center of an impossible negotiation, his ship becoming neutral ground where reformists from both sides gathered to hammer out a ceasefire that hardliners called treason and historians would later call humanity's most important treaty. Through it all, Lyra was beside him, her diplomatic training and understanding of Caltharian political factions proving invaluable. Her presence a constant reminder that the enemy had faces and families and dreams worth preserving. The negotiations stretched across 3 weeks of heated arguments, near breakdowns, and slowly building trust. And during the rare quiet moments, Marcus and Lyra would retreat to the observation deck, sitting in comfortable silence or talking about futures that seemed impossible and wonderful. What will you do when this is over? Marcus asked one night, watching a binary star system paint her features in gold and amber. If we succeed, I'll probably spend years testifying, explaining, defending the choice to trust you, Lyra said thoughtfully. The Empire doesn't forgive easily, and there will be many who see me as a traitor who sided with humanity over her own kind. But I think I'd rather be a traitor to a corrupt system than loyal to one that murders dreamers and peacemakers. She turned to face him fully, and the vulnerability in her expression made his breath catch. But I hope I'll also have time for simpler things, like learning more about human music, seeing Earth's oceans. You described. Maybe spending time with a stubborn commander who saved my life and then trusted me to help save millions more. Marcus felt his heart race. The implication of her words, both thrilling and terrifying in their intimacy. That commander sounds like he'd be honored, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. And maybe a little scared because he wasn't supposed to feel this way about someone from the Empire. Wasn't supposed to see past the uniform and the pointed ears to find someone extraordinary who makes him want to be better than his grief and anger. Lyra's hand found his, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that felt like coming home. And when she leaned her head on his shoulder, Marcus understood that some bonds transcend the boundaries people draw between themselves and others. The ceasefire was finally signed in the neutral space between fleets, broadcast across both civilizations. A fragile peace built on evidence, courage, and the choice to see former enemies as potential allies. General Sarah Voss was posthumously honored by both sides. Her death reframed not as an act of war, but as a murder that catalyzed exposure of the rot within both power structures. Her legacy becoming the peace she had fought for rather than the war others had used her death to justify. Marcus was promoted and offered command of a new joint task force. Humans and Caltharians working together to hunt down the remaining conspirators and rebuild trust through shared missions and cultural exchange. He accepted on one condition that Lyra serve as his diplomatic liaison and cultural advisor, a role she embraced with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything. The months that followed were challenging, filled with setbacks and successes. Incidents where old hatreds flared and moments where former enemies became genuine friends. And through it all, Marcus and Lyra's partnership deepened into something neither could deny. They navigated the complexities of an interspecies relationship in the public eye with the same courage they had brought to stopping the war, facing criticism from both sides while refusing to hide or apologize for finding love in the midst of chaos. 1 year after the ceasefire, Marcus stood in the memorial garden on Earth. Lyra, beside him, wearing a human-style dress in deep blue that made her luminescent skin seem to glow. Both of them placing flowers at General Voss's monument. Do you think she would have approved? Lyra asked softly, her accent still present, but softer now, shaped by months of living among humans. Marcus considered the question, remembering his mentor's fierce intelligence and her belief that strength came from understanding, not domination. The general once told me that the hardest battles aren't against enemies you can see, but against the limitations we place on our own hearts and minds, he said. Reading the inscription on the monument, true victory is not in the destruction of our enemies, but in the transformation of enmity itself. I think she'd say we fought the right battle, even if it wasn't the one either side expected. Lyra smiled, that radiant expression that still made his heart skip, and squeezed his hand with a gentle pressure that communicated more than words. Around them, the garden filled with humans and Caltharians, diplomats and veterans, families of the fallen from both sides, who had chosen to honor their dead with peace rather than perpetuating the cycle of violence. It wasn't a perfect peace, there were still tensions. Still, factions on both sides who dreamed of renewed conflict. Still scars that would take generations to heal, but it was real and worth fighting for. Build on the courage of those who chose to see beyond what they had been taught to hate. Marcus thought about that moment in the medbay when he had first seen Lyra. How easily he could have followed protocol and either left her to die or treated her as an enemy combatant. How that single choice to listen, to risk compassion over caution, had cascaded into changes that reshaped the galaxy. What are you thinking? Lyra asked, knowing him well enough to read the contemplative expression on his face. That sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight against our own assumptions, Marcus replied, turning to face her fully. That you saved me as much as I saved you, maybe more. Because you reminded me that courage isn't just about fighting. It's about staying open to connection, even when every instinct screams to close off and protect yourself. Lyra's violet eyes shimmered with emotion, and she reached up to touch his face with a tenderness that felt sacred. My father used to say that the greatest act of rebellion against those who profit from division is to build bridges they insist cannot exist, she whispered. We are that bridge, Marcus. living proof that the boundaries between us and them are illusions maintained by fear and ignorance. And every day we choose each other, we make those illusions a little less powerful. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, aware of the eyes watching, but no longer caring about anything except this moment. This person who had walked through fire with him and emerged as his partner in every way that mattered. When they finally pulled apart, the garden had erupted in quiet applause from both species. A sound that felt like hope made audible, and Marcus realized that General Voss's death, though a tragedy orchestrated by small men with cruel ambitions, had ultimately catalyzed something beautiful and necessary, the end of a war that should never have been, and the beginning of a peace that would define generations. Lyra Valshara, the alien girl who had lost everything and risked what remained on the chance that an enemy might choose compassion over vengeance, had become the symbol of that peace. Her face, known across both civilizations as the bridge builder, the diplomat who had stood before her own people and humanity alike and declared that there was a better way. As they walked through the memorial garden together, Marcus reflected on how far they had come from that desperate rescue in the debris field. From two people carrying grief and duty to partners who had helped reshape the galaxy's future. The joint task force had become a model for cooperation. Human and Caltharian crews not just working together, but forming genuine friendships, learning each other's languages and customs, building the foundation for a lasting peace one relationship at a time. There would be more challenges ahead, the conspirators still at large, factions opposed to integration. The simple difficulty of merging two different cultures with their own traumas and histories, but Marcus faced that future with something he hadn't felt since General Voss died: hope. Genuine and unshakable, rooted in the knowledge that change was possible when people chose courage over comfort. That night, alone in their shared quarters overlooking Earth's glittering cityscape, Lyra stood at the window with that same contemplative expression she wore when processing deep emotions. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had left me in that debris field?" she asked, and Marcus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Every day," he admitted, "and every day I'm grateful I listened to the instinct that said, some risks are worth taking. That protocol and caution have their place, but so does faith in the possibility of connection across any divide." Lyra leaned back into his embrace, fitting against him with a rightness that still amazed him. "The Empire taught me that emotions were weakness, that attachment made you vulnerable, that the only path to strength was isolation and dominance," she said softly. "But you showed me that vulnerability is courage, that attachment gives us reasons to be strong beyond ourselves, that real power comes from the bonds we build rather than the walls we maintain." Her words captured something essential about their journey. The transformation they had both undergone, from soldiers following orders to people making choices based on conscience and connection. Marcus thought about the young commander who had watched his mentor die and wanted nothing more than vengeance against the Empire. How that pain had nearly consumed him until a dying alien girl had offered him something more valuable than revenge: purpose, partnership, and proof that the galaxy was more complex and wonderful than his grief allowed him to see. "I love you," he said simply, the words still new enough to feel momentous, but familiar enough to feel true. "Not despite what you are, but because of who you are. Because you're brave and brilliant and stubborn enough to believe that two people from opposite sides of a war could build something beautiful from the ruins." Lyra turned in his arms, her face illuminated by Earth's lights and her own soft bioluminescence, tears tracking down her cheeks, but her smile radiant and unafraid. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion. "You gave me back my faith in people, when I had every reason to believe the worst of both our kinds. You showed me that heroism isn't about grand gestures, but about small choices made consistently toward connection and compassion rather than fear and hate." They stood like that for a long moment. Two people from different worlds who had found each other in the chaos of war and chosen to build peace together. Their story already becoming legend among both species as proof that enmity wasn't destiny, that the future could be shaped by those brave enough to reach across the void. The Galactic Empire's assassination of General Sarah Voss had been meant to break humanity's spirit, to prove that resistance was futile and submission inevitable. But instead, it had exposed the corruption within both civilizations, catalyzed a reform movement that toppled warmongers and brought dreamers to power, and created the conditions for an alliance that made both peoples stronger than either had been alone. Marcus knew the general would have appreciated the irony that her death meant to end hope, had instead planted seeds that grew into something those who killed her never anticipated: unity, forged not through conquest, but through the courage of those who refused to let hate have the final word. As he held Lyra and looked out at the city where humans and Caltharians now walked the same streets, worked the same jobs, built the same dreams, Marcus Chen understood that this was the war's true ending, not in victory or defeat, but in transformation, in the radical choice to see former enemies as future family, in love that transcended the boundaries others insisted were absolute. And somewhere in the quantum foam of spacetime, he liked to imagine General Voss watching with approval, her sacrifice redeemed not by the war it was meant to start, but by the peace her students had built from its ashes.